In today's episode, we will discuss the role lotteries play in admissions and how they contribute to fair and equitable admissions. With that, let's talk holistic success. Hi everyone, I'm Anju Visen-Singh and I'm the VP of Marketing at Acuity Insights. Welcome to this episode of the Holistic Success Show. Here with me today is Dr. Kelly Dore. She is the VP of Science and Innovation at Acuity Insights. Kelly is also a PhD researcher and an adjunct professor at McMaster University. She has a background in cognitive psychology and higher education, and she's also a very influential speaker and thought leader in holistic success in education. So, with that, welcome, Kelly.
Thanks, Anju. I am so excited to be here on the other side of the table today and chat with you.
That's true. That's true. As you know, I always love putting you in the hot seat. So here we go. Great to have you here. And my first question to you is, what are lottery admissions, and what's an example of how they might work?
Absolutely. Lottery admissions are not as common right now, but they're starting to gain a little bit traction. We're hearing about them in the media. We're seeing it being used a little bit more in North America. So let's unpack a little bit about what they are and how they work. So, a lottery process in your admissions can be used at different points within your admissions process and help to define who progresses to the next stage, whether that's from application to interview or from application to offer or from interview to offer. At different stages it can be used, and it's meant to complement a holistic admissions process. Oftentimes lotteries are used to support a fairer process in admissions. So it means that everybody who passes a certain criteria is entered into the lottery. So if, for example, I'm going to be offering 60 places at my institution, I may run a lottery whereby everybody who is eligible meets my criteria, and we'll talk about what those criteria can be. I might get 250 folks who meet those criteria. And then I simply run a lottery for who gets offered those 60 places. So it's a way to sort of use the standardized or admissions information, but also create a fair process of selecting folks on the other end. So not just be fully beholden to those metrics in a hope of maybe getting a more diverse class, people with different experiences and different perspectives. So let's talk a little bit more about why lotteries are put in the first place. It's really an acknowledgement that some of the metrics that we're using have significant bias associated with them, meaning groups perform differently. And it also acknowledges that with some data points that we're using, say standardized tests, top performers, so those in the top decile or top quartile, don't necessarily perform that different in their class, like once they're in school, than those who are maybe in the top 50% or the top 40%. So, there's no added value in sort of saying, if you're in the top 10% of performers on, say, an MCAT or an SAT, that you're going to do that much better than those who are in the 40th percentile or those who are in the 60th percentile. So it's really trying to figure out how we use that information to the best purposes, because historically we've been using these academic data points primarily to say, they are true information on who can be successful. So a GPA of 3.9 versus a GPA of 3.89, we're saying one is better than the other. One is significantly going to perform differently. And the reality is that's not true. And so it just means when you get to a point where lottery, we're establishing, okay, who is going to be able to complete our program? Who's going to be successful? And above that, you're eligible for entry. And then everything sort of, your slate gets wiped clean and everybody has an equal shot at it. And I think it's a goal of really trying to understand how we can create a fairer process, how we can ensure we're widening pathways into our programs, and how we're making sure we're not disadvantaging folks who might have otherwise not been competitive in coming into our programs because of the old thresholds that we might have had.
That is so interesting. So, it's pretty evident that it's a really interesting and maybe effective admission strategy to use because it opens the door to so many people. And it's not putting artificial like cutoffs and stuff that eliminate people without any meaningful sort of differentiation between one applicant and the other.
Well, and I still think we need to be careful of thresholds. And let me tell you a little bit more about sort of the history of lotteries and maybe where the future of lotteries could go from there. So, most commonly, we associate lotteries with actually the Netherlands because they've used in the Dutch system lotteries for their very highly competitive medical school applications. And they've done so because they wanted to diversify pathways into their admissions process. So, one of the things we want to acknowledge is lotteries can be used in a lot of different ways, but oftentimes the history of them are attributed to thresholds. Applicants still needed to meet certain thresholds. Oftentimes, when we're talking about the Dutch model, academic thresholds, whether that was grade point average or other academic cuts, where if they reached that cut, they would be entered into a lottery. Historically, the Dutch system allotted points. So the higher your GPA, the more entries you got into the lottery, therefore the higher chances were that you could get in. Now, some folks don't like this model because it's not doesn't guarantee you a place. There have been stories in the media, in fact, of folks who have had perfect or near perfect academic scores who applied for 3, 4, 5 years in a row without getting into the medical schools because it's still a competitive process and it's still a lottery. So it means that it's not based purely on having a perfect academic model. Now, the Netherlands, in fact, there's really interesting data where after implementing lotteries in the 70s, they moved away in the past few years away from lotteries, thinking that perhaps they weren't the fairest. There had been these stories about people with perfect grades who still weren't getting in. Were they missing out on folks? And what they found is when they removed the lotteries, 3 to 4 years later, they actually went back to them. Because what they found is that the diversity of their classes decreased significantly when they took away the lotteries and they were just using these thresholds. That makes sense, Anju. That's data that we've seen elsewhere too. So lotteries, very interestingly, could have a really neat place within higher education for very competitive programs where they use this data and use this information to help select who's going to be in their entry class. Now, as we talked about, though, there is more than a threshold for consideration. We'll talk about that later, about the different ways you might be able to combine and maybe what the future of lotteries could be.
We've talked about why schools should be using lotteries, and
Mm,
universities. What are some of the things that they should be mindful of? You talked about the academic cutoffs as one of the things, but are
absolutely.
there other things that people need to consider in order to make this actually a successful program
Mhm.
versus one that, is fraught with challenges?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I want us to always remember when we're doing an admissions process is that we have to remember our why, our mission, our program. What are our goals? Because it's not cookie cutter. What one school is doing may not work for us, and that's okay. We might have to tweak it, we might have to understand it, but you have to ask yourself a few questions. What are the reasons that you're considering a lottery? What parts of your program aren't working right now for you? What are you not seeing in the outcome of your process? Is it not a diverse class? Is it, you're not reaching certain outcomes or things that you wanted? Are you not getting enough applicants in because your thresholds are too high, etc.? Then the other side of it is what aspects are important. We've talked about lotteries with respect to academics. But as we think about a holistic process, academics aren't the only factor. We talk about a holistic admissions, and just as a quick reminder, what a holistic admissions process is it's gathering more data points, more information, so you get a broader picture of who the applicant is. That means, yes, academics, we're not saying academics aren't important, but academics plus life experiences, plus their personal and professional attributes, their resiliency, their communication, their collaboration, other data points like that we know are going to be either factors in their success or may have impacted their admissions data points. It could include things like socioeconomic status or other things that we know might have negatively influenced some of their other data points. So you can add these all together to understand what is the true potential of these applicants, because oftentimes we're underestimating folks' true potential. So thinking about what data points are important for you, how does that align to your admissions? You may want to think about, how you're using these data points. We've talked about threshold, but that oftentimes is meaningful for something like an academic. We talked about why it's useful for an academic, that, you know, top performers, that 3.9 versus the 3.89, they're not going to be performing that differently in the program. But there are other data points when you start looking at personal and professional attributes where there is different information. So folks on a situational judgment test like Casper, which is an open-ended situational judgment test, what we know is it's not just there as a data point to eliminate low performers. That's not fully what the data point is. It actually gives you information on those who are exceptional at communication, resiliency, motivation, collaboration, broad aspects like that that inform their future success. So you want to maybe not just use it as a threshold, but actually be able to use it as a plus factor in somebody's admissions process. So an additive data point. So how do you do that? And so do you want to use a threshold or a rubric or a formula? And these are all different ways that you can use it to inform. So threshold we've talked about, that's kind of like a cut score where you may not, be eligible if you don't reach a minimum hurdle. The tricky bit with that is that if I don't have the 3.54 required and instead I have a 3.53 GPA, I'm eliminated. But I may
Mhm.
have exceptional other attributes. So I may have exceptional personal and professional attributes. I might have great standardized test scores. I might have really good life experiences, whether that's extracurricular or demonstrated work experience or things which are going to contribute to my success. But you don't get to see any of that if you use a single data point as a cut. And so that's why people are turning to rubrics or formulas in their lottery. And that's what's potential has the potential to change the future of lotteries, where it's not just that single data point that is the cut score. You can't go any further, where it's, sort of this gate that closes on applicants. Rather, we're getting that whole picture. So taking their GPA, plus maybe their Casper SJT score, which demonstrates their communication and resilience and teamwork skills and other things on top of that. And you can use a rubric model where you assign certain points, on a 1 to 4 or 0 to 4, depending on your model. You can use different scales where how high you get, you might get different point systems, but it's a combined point total that get you into the lottery. So you could have a slightly lower standardized test score or slightly lower GPA or a slightly lower Casper and still have a combined strength of potential that allows you into the program. Very similarly, a formula can be used where we combine the different scores at weights that we assign. So we can assign academics a little bit more weights than their personal and professional attribute. We can decide what makes sense for our program. And we combine those together in a weighted model, and everybody who achieves a certain percentage within the model gets entered into the lottery. And those are all different ways that programs can consider using it that really can make an impact in what their overall pathway looks like into their program.
That's amazing. Thank you for explaining that, Kelly. I was wondering what type of programs are using lotteries now, and how should, other programs be thinking about maybe incorporating this into their own practice?
Absolutely. So I think programs that are using the lottery right now have been those in the highly selective space. So oftentimes we hear about it from medical school. Queen's University in Canada, in Ontario, recently moved to a lottery based system as part of their process. But we heard a lot about it in the Netherlands for their medical schools. It doesn't mean other schools can't use lotteries, though, for different types of programs as well, because what it can do is, in fact, change the way you think about eligibility. So oftentimes, it allows us to potentially say for our holistic process, we might have a slightly lower academic cut than we would use, or academic minimum that we might use as part of our formula or as part of our data point, because there's other factors going into that as well. And so for those who are not highly selective, this might widen the pathway for those who are coming in. It might be useful for programs that have, a history of legacy admissions or other factors where maybe they want to demonstrate a reset and a fairness in their process, so that what that means is when they use that system, more folks feel competitive into their process because they don't think that they're going to be excluded based on a single data point or other factors which aren't, really telling of their future success. And so that has an opportunity to create a much more leveled playing field in the admissions process, but it does need to be done with transparency. We always talk about this, we always hear about this, is that, there's a feeling of confusion for applicants applying to colleges, universities, or professional programs. And that is true. There's a lot going on. Different schools are doing different things. So you need to be clear on your website about the factors that influence your lottery system. What are the data points that are going into it? How are they each being included? So that folks know whether or not they should be applying to your program, whether or not they're eligible.
What does it feel like for the applicant? So the school is doing, certain things to make sure that it is really widening the pathway into their school. But what about applicants? Because for them, it's like, if I did this and if I did that and if I did the other, there's a very high chance I'll get in. But now there's a lottery. So I don't know whether if I did everything right, I would still make it.
Absolutely. And I think that that's frustrating for students, for advisors, for applicants, parents, as they're thinking about how do I make sure I guarantee an entry? And I think that's where schools and applicants need to think about mission. Because one factor that we haven't talked about in the lottery is mission and how we bring that in. So we've talked about it as influencing the factors that you might consider, but how, if at all, do we also maybe give a weighting to folks who are more aligned to our mission, who, want to support and do work that serves our mission, whether that's that they're from our community that we're trying to support with our mission, whether that's because they want to engage with certain populations that are part of our mission, or whether it's because, there's other attributes that they have as who they are as a whole person that factor into that. So, a few things that schools can do is also assign a mission metric. And we've seen schools do that. There's schools that are doing that incredibly well, like the University of Tyler, Texas. A medical school is doing a great example of including mission as a metric in how they're selecting their applicants. And then that allows applicants to say, whose mission do I align to as a student to help pick which schools they might be more successful at. And this alignment to mission increases student satisfaction when they're in the program, but it also increases their, engagement with the community. When a school has a true mission aligned initiative, they're bringing the communities in that their mission is aligned to into the program so that students can start to engage and be successful all the way through. So what I would say is, as we talk about lotteries with the goal to create a more level playing field for folks to apply to, we need to ensure that we're allowing transparency so that applicants and all of the folks involved in supporting them through this application process, and I say this as a parent, know what all the pieces are that are factoring in there, and then understanding that school's mission and where you might want to apply and using that as a factor to determine, along with geography, along with other logistical things, where you should be applying and where you should be trying to advocate to spend your time in.
Yeah, that's such a good point because then that for the applicant that ensures that they will be successful once they are in. Any final piece of advice, Kelly? This was all such great information, but is there anything else you'd like to add on this topic?
I'll maybe, just reinforce a couple of points that we talked about, Anju, because we went through a few things, is this is not a cookie cutter approach. So you need to be willing to look at your data both before and after the lottery to understand, what changed, what didn't change, what was unintentionally changed that maybe you didn't know would change. Are you adding in more biases? Are there other things that are happening? How are you being clear about this? So you need to not just take somebody else's process and apply it to you. That can be a starting point, but make sure you're really and truly looking at your own mission. How are you serving your mission by applying the lottery? because it is still relatively new. We don't have a ton of data on it. And so, how are you going to be using and looking at your information to make sure you're creating a process that's right for you? And then, last but not least, is consider your data points. So, if you had a high academic threshold now, do you still need to maintain that high academic threshold, or could you move to a rubric or a formula where you create a little bit more flexibility to ensure you're including everybody who has the potential for success in your program?
Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Kelly. You have shared with us some great strategies that schools can take away and immediately use and implement and definitely think about as they think about various ways in which to widen pathways into their institution and also, continue to evolve the admissions process. To all of you, thank you for listening and watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And do share this episode with colleagues who might find the information that we've shared over here useful. Catch you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode of our Holistic Success Show, please be sure to check out our other episodes. And don't forget to subscribe. We have new episodes coming out every week, so hope to see you as a subscriber soon.